Hey everyone, I'm rather incoherent, and lately I've been learning to make mods for XCOM 2. My collection on the Steam Workshop had an ever-growing list of I&I changes that were becoming a progressively larger barrier to entry for anyone who wanted to play the campaign that I was playing, so I needed to make a metamod for it. And as I learned to mod, the scope of my changes ballooned and got larger and larger, and I realized that inevitably somebody would download it for one thing and not wanting another and begrudgingly either not using the mod or accepting changes they didn't want. To some degree, that's always inevitable, but I have broken up my single metamod into 4 sub-mods to try to avoid that a little bit. I'm going to cover them briefly now before I dive into all of them in much more detail. The 8-man core is just that. It's the core set of changes you need to run an 8-man campaign, specifically in Covert Infiltration with the Proficiency class pack and a couple of its plugins. The Enemies mod is mostly a compatibility patch between a bunch of other popular enemy mods. Skirmishers is a rework of the Proficiency Skirmisher class, and it tweaks is the grab bag terminology for literally everything that doesn't fit neatly into one of the other 3 categories. Before I dive into the specifics of any of these, I want to give a brief disclaimer, a couple of them actually. First, there is no new code in here at all. I've coded nothing, all I've done is change the configs of INIs that were left exposed to me by modders and base game developers. I stand on the shoulders of giants here, and all credits go to them. I'll have full credits in this video, and credits for each different sub-mod on their workshop pages. I would also like to reiterate that this is my first mod. I've checked, I'm not throwing any red screens, all I'm doing is changing INI files, so as far as I can tell, with one exception that I'll cover in a second, this should be as compatible with other mods as the mods I'm changing were, and it shouldn't be causing crashes. But that's currently something I'm testing while playing my own campaign with this. My preliminary testing suggests that all of this works and I've done a good job, but I'm not going to be surprised at all when I find out that's not the case, so buyer beware, I guess is what I'm getting at here. Which isn't a great way to pump people up about my mod, let's be honest, but the simple fact is that whatever problems I have, whatever I've done wrong, I don't even know about it. I'm pretty sure I've done it right, but that's always going to be the case. Someone's going to be like, oh yeah, there's this thing, you don't even know it exists, you ruined it all. So I'm hoping that's not the case. It looks like it all works to me, but I just want to give you a heads up. And one last thing, this is a video, it's not going to get updated. Invariably, as time goes on, I will update these mods, I will change them in some ways. Eventually, this video will be inaccurate in a lot of small ways, but the gist of it will remain true. Now, because I was just giving a bunch of disclaimers, I want to first talk about rain rebalance enemies. Specifically, I want to come over to XCOM Game INI and talk about which mods I'm currently supporting. Right now, this is a compatibility patch, or mostly a compatibility patch, between Revamped Generals, Revamped Purifiers, Omega Berserkers, Biodivision, Muton Harriers, Purge Priests, Sectoid Commanders, Jerome Dome, The Hive, World War Lost, Better Advent, Black Ice Codexes, Frost Division, and Leb's late-game enemies. The reason I'm mentioning this immediately, and the reason I'm coming here after giving a bunch of disclaimers about when things might not work, is because if you're running this mod without any of those mods that it's for, I'm like 100% sure that it should mess up your game. Because what it should do is it should end up trying to pull enemies from a mod you don't have, and when that happens, it should be crashing your tactical missions the moment you try to load in. So please don't do that. I've listed them as required for a reason. If I'm wrong, better safe than sorry, but I'm pretty sure that's how it works. And on that subject, while I might eventually make another enemy mod similar to this one, using the same exact rules and metrics of this one, I will never add to this one. Because if I were to add another enemy mod to this, if I were to throw in, say, Armored Vipers, which is an awesome mod, I love Armored Vipers, suddenly everyone who ever downloaded this and doesn't have Armored Vipers doesn't start having random crashes because I've done that. So while I'm not against the idea of trying to make a second enemy mod or adding support to any of the other mods, this mod specifically will never have new mods added to it for fear of ruining people's games. So what do I mean when I call the enemy mod a compatibility patch for other enemy mods? Let's head over to Harriers, and I'll talk about it there. You can see that they have a spawn weight in all the tables. Whether it's default leaders or terror leaders, whatever category of enemy buckets we're pulling from, everyone has a spawn weight. This number doesn't have an absolute value, it's relative to other spawn weights. It just determines how likely a unit is to show up, the higher it is, the more likely you see it. And there isn't an objectively correct weight, but the issue is that different mods have different philosophies, and that means they might not play nice with each other. The most quintessential and well-known example of this, I would think, is Biodivision and Frost Legion. Frost Legion shows up like 1 in 5, 1 in 6 enemies. It's a minority of your game, but a substantial enough percentage that you're gonna know they're there. Biodivision has a very high spawn weighting. If you're playing with Biodivision, it's the Biodivision campaign. They're like half of the units you encounter. And if you play with both of them, that crushes down Frost Legion so much. It's down to like 1 in 10, 1 in 11 enemies are Frost Legion enemies. And then they never show up in a Biodivision pawn, so that actually crushes them down even more. And it's not that Frost Legion is too low or that Biodivision is too high. They're both fine individually. But when you put them together, if they have different spawn weight philosophies, they don't play nice together. One of them will suffer. So the first thing I do is I try to normalize that. You can see with any of these encounter lists, spawn weights 30, 20, 60. You come over to Lebs. All right, Lebs is all boss enemies, not a good example. You come over to Drome Dome, 15, 15, 15 for 3 virtually identical enemies, totaling 45. And if you come over to Biodivision specifically, you'll see it's actually much lower than that because there's so many more individual units that we've crushed it down a little bit more on the leaders and a lot more on the followers. In fact, it's the same weights roughly as you would see in Frost Legion. And the result is that all the modded enemies get to show up in roughly equal proportions, or at least enough that you recognize they're all there and none of them feel like they're not showing up at all. The second file that you see in virtually everything is going to be the character stats. And the reason it's relevant for us is it tells you what the supported followers are. When a unit's being generated, when a pod is made, there's a bucket it pulls from, like Terror or Terror No Chrysalids or Default or Advent. And when it does, it's going to pick a leader, and then it's going to fill out the pod to its max size with supported followers. There's a follower bucket for the mission type, and then supported followers for the leader, and it's only the overlap they pull from. So for instance, the Berserker Omega allowed all vanilla enemies that were mutons to follow it and had built-in support for the Biozerker. So I've added every new modded Berserker to its supported followers. I haven't just added all the new enemies to all the new enemies. It's just the ones that would be thematically appropriate. Something that was fire-themed never got Frost followers. Something that was Frost-themed never got Bio followers to keep those two separate. If something was already being done in theme pods, like Biopods and Frost pods and Purge Priest pods, those never got new followers, they stayed as theme pods. The point is just to give compatibility where compatibility should be. Now, unfortunately, that's not all this mod does. People might be happier if that's all this mod does, but there are some other tweaks getting made here. There are 3 things that come to mind. The first is if we come over to Sectoid Commanders, I've actually buffed them across the board. They have 10 more psi offense and 4 more health at all levels. It's a pretty substantial buff, but I felt they were not nearly as threatening as a bunch of the other late game enemies. And this leads into the reason why Sectoid Commanders needed a buff. I have removed some enemies from a Better Advent. A Better Advent is the core of this mod, the thing that everyone else is balanced around, because it fleshes out the core roster of enemy troops. However, in places where I thought other mods did it in a way that fit together more nicely, I have removed enemies from a Better Advent. The most extreme example of this coming over to a Better Advent is the Chrysalids folder, where I've simply removed all of the ABA Chrysalids from the game. It's not because they're bad. A Better Advent's a great mod and its Chrysalids were great. However, I'm running the Hive. I don't want 2 side-by-side Chrysalid progression systems where it's sort of weird and hard to keep track of why there's 2 separate sets of Chrysalids with separate names and separate regression paths. I would rather the Hive do its thing, and ADA step back and let the dedicated Chrysalid overhaul handle the Chrysalids. What's that have to do with Sectoid Commander? Well, we have removed every prime. We haven't just turned them off with the Baby's Advent, we've removed them entirely from the spawn list. All of the import enemies, the Berserkers, the Berserker Fires, when you come over to the new list, they're just not there. The reason I've done this is because while I do actually really like the prime enemies, I run the mod that makes rewards function like primes even. I feel when you run a lot of enemy mods, they're kind of incongruous with the rest. You end up playing this mini game within the game, where you're sort of like still modding the game while you play it. You're watching out, is this a prime enemy from Better Advent? Is it from a different mod? What rule set are we playing with? And it takes me out of XCOM. When you're playing with just a Better Advent, it's a core part of the rhythm is looking for the primes, but as they become less and less of an overall percentage of your enemies, especially when you add more late game enemy mods, it starts to take you out of it. So I've removed the primes outright, and where I thought there were mods that directly comparably had late game enemies, I've included those to replace the primes. That's why I have Sectoid Commanders, because without them there would be no late game Sectoids. And while generally I've had people fill the slots that were available, I have Drome Dome instead of Andromedon Prime, I have Muton Devastator leaders instead of Muton Primes, I haven't gone out of my way to try to fill all the gaps. As long as an alien type is shown at the late game, that's good enough for me. I don't specifically need that race to be a threatening late game enemy. That said, most of them do show up as threatening late game enemies, it's just not like direct one-to-one comparisons to the primes that have been cut. There are also a bunch of other smaller changes that will undoubtedly slip through the cracks. Things like, in base ADA, the max for a number of Archons in a group was 8, which I've lowered to 4, and 4 is still so high that you'll never hit it, but 8 was just unreasonably high. Or what I call the 2-trooper fix. You'll never see this in the base game. If you're playing with normal pod size, you're never going to notice this bug, but it was a serious problem for me, and it's not a bug, it's just an oversight, I guess. Troopers are a pod leader in the early game, but they don't have any of the new supporters from a better advent. They don't get to use any of these like pistol troopers or sniper troopers as followers, and their max size was reduced to 2. So you would end up with pods of 2 where the trooper's the leader, the trooper's the follower, and you're not allowed to have more troopers. So by adding all of these dudes in as viable followers for troopers, you fix that bug as well. So there are definitely more changes I've made, minor stuff like that, that's all built towards this goal of having a cohesive enemy experience where all the pods are fully generated as cross-compatible as possible with equal representation across all mods. Coming over to the 8-man core mod, you can see I still have enemy changes here as well, they're just a different sort. When you're playing with an 8-man squad instead of a 6-man squad, all of the bosses need more health. You have 33% more people if they have the same amount of health and they're being focus fired by your whole squad, which is usually the case, they're going to be proportionally weaker, easier enemies. So all of the rulers, all of the chosen, and even the Children of the King mod, I've buffed their health by 20 to 33% across the board. I think I usually aired much closer to 20% than 33%, but still a substantial buff. And a quick heads up about me being new to modding, evidently, this isn't necessary. I could just do that and it would work, I've been told. But everyone else does this, and I'll be damned if I do it wrong because I'm getting variables and arrays wrong, so I'm just doing it this way across the board, which leads to some very funny stuff. I'm joking about it here in my notes. And I don't know if you're running a better Chosen or Vanilla, but I know if I remove a variable, it doesn't matter if the variable didn't exist. So I just remove both values to be extra sure that it's being done. When neither of these lines did anything, it's the epitome of coding voodoo bullshit. But getting back to the actual important things this mod does, coming down to the bottom, you can also see that I've toned down Space Eggs and Angry Cyclopods here. Those are basically boss enemies, and those mods make them much more threatening. However, they are kind of unreasonably threatening, especially in the health department, so I've toned them down substantially from their vanilla values. Especially Gatekeepers. Just because Gatekeepers having more health than Rift Keepers would feel very weird. There are a bunch of changes here that are just core changes you have to make. I gave you 10 more starting soldiers because you have bigger squads. Coming over to game data, I have increased the squad size from 6 to 8 on both covert infiltrations and normal assaults. I've made the risk thresholds proportional to that. I've also banned the card Recruiting Centers. This is sort of a balance change, but I think it's very important. Recruiting Centers is grossly overpowered. It allows you to just instantly max out your living space, go on so many more missions, get so much more resources, and really snowball the game hard in your favor. I think it's one of the more aggressively imbalanced cards that doesn't get talked about at all. Speaking of living space, I've had to buff up the numbers for that a little bit to make room for all the new soldiers. Previously, it would have been 30, 40, 50. Now it's 35, 50, 65. And those numbers feel pretty close to spot on for me. I've also got Leviathan squad size installed and compatibility set so that you start off with 10-man size going to Leviathan, which would end up actually being 12 because I have Rift Keepers installed for their teleportation device to bring in 2 more people. But getting back to things that people don't really talk about being overpowered and needing a change, I have nerfed the experience you need for leveling up. There are 2 factors to that in the base game. You have the required kills to level up, and then separately, every class has its own kill assist number. Coming down to XCOM game data here, you can see that in the base game we needed 175 experience to reach Colonel, and I've upped that to 265, roughly 50% more. You can also see that I've focused on really round numbers, 1, 10, 25, 60, 100, 150, 265, numbers that are going to multiply smoothly, and that seems like a weird thing to focus on, but the way Kill Assist works is it's just a multiplier to everything except the value of an assist. For those who don't know, in XCOM, you get assist experience. Whenever anything is killed by XCOM, well, anything bad, not civilians. Whenever you kill any enemy units, every unit on XCOM gets 1 assist experience. It doesn't matter if they saw the enemy, if they helped kill the enemy, if they touched the guy who did the killing, everyone gets the assist. Even the guy who did the killing, he gets an assist for himself. What the kill assist number does is that it multiplies how much experience you get when you get a kill, and it multiplies how much experience you need to level up outright. So the only thing it doesn't touch is that assist value, and therefore the higher the kill assist number, the proportionally more valuable an assist is. Lower numbers are better for support classes because they get less kills and need to level up naturally through assist more than a killing class like a marksman would. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself here. Why did I make it take so much more experience to level up? Why did I make it 50% worse? And counting my other changes, actually worse than that, even. In a modded 8-man campaign, you're going to have way more enemies showing up. And as a result of that, you're going to get way more kill experience. I have literally double the number of enemies as a base campaign game would have, but I only got 33% more troops, so I'm proportionally getting much more assist experience, much more kill experience, and literally double the assist experience. So I'm leveling very close to, if not twice as fast as I should normally be leveling. I need to slow down the rates we level up, so we have to tone these numbers back down. Coming over to the kill assist numbers, I currently only have this set up for the proficiency class back classes that I actually use. Originally, they went from 3 to 4 to 5, with support technomatic at 3, most at 4, and specifically only the Marine at 5 for some reason. I have nerfed them across the board. Support classes are now at a kill assist of 4, leveling a bit slower themselves. All the killing classes are down to 5, where the Marine has stayed. I've also left the Tech Specialist at 4, I consider them a support class. I could have sworn that I have changed this in the past to be commented out like the Marine. I'll have to do that between videos. Anyway, the big one here is that sparks are all at 10. Why are sparks getting crippled compared to everyone else in terms of leveling speed? Well, in Covert Infiltration, you get a lot of assaults, and you're not really meant to go on all of them. But sparks don't get tired, so if you have enough sparks to go on these assaults, then suddenly your sparks are getting 2 missions a week minimum, and everyone else is getting maybe a mission a week. Your sparks level crazy fast. I had a Colonel Pioneer before July, which is crazy, and my Infiltrator, which I made much, much later as almost a Colonel, my artillery spark got to Lieutenant in under a week. So yeah, we need to nerf the experience gains, especially for sparks, and that's why we've done all of this. Now while I'm here, I should talk about the value of corpses and how it warps the economy of the game. You need more resources in an 8-man campaign. You need more Ethereum and alloys to make all your gear, and you're also going to get way more supplies from selling the corpses. So how do we fix these things? Well, I'm going to just hand that off to other mods and hope it sorts itself out. For the additional resources that we're going to need in terms of alien alloys and Illyrium, I've installed Loot Pinata's Lights. Hopefully that'll help a little bit. I'm hoping that it feels close enough to balance and I don't need to fine-tune it from there. For reducing the corpse supplies that we get, I've installed Explosives Destroy Corpses. Seems like a clean solution, and it gives more strategic depth. Actually, Loot Pinatas does too, because I want to get the loot more if I know it might be alloys. It changes the way I play the game, it gives me more decisions to make, and it affects the economy in positive ways. I'm not actually touching the economy at all here. I know I could change the scalar numbers for the cost of gear, but I don't want to do that. I'd much rather do it this way and see if it works like that. Which leaves us with only diverse alien by force levels. Here are my settings for it. I've set it to control the lost as well, and for lost and reinforcements, it's not going to have any scaling numbers. It just flat adds 2 to them at all points in the game. The reason I'm adding 2 is because with 8-man squads, they need more units, period, end of story. With the lost, I don't want it to scale up more than that, because let's be real, they're not going to be a threat. They need enough to feel appropriately large, but more than that's just going to lag out your game. With reinforcements, there are several different mission types ready to hold out against multiple waves of reinforcements, dropping 2 at a time. I don't want them to scale up past this point. They can get out of hand so much. So even though I could make them scale up just like base game units, I'm just going to stay at front-loaded 2 and do nothing additionally past that. And then coming over to the normal unit pods, we have that same front-loaded 2, and you're going to see a bunch of things like this, min 2, max 2, and then 3 to 3, 4 to 4, but they're only active for 1 force level, and it's just a chance to add 1 that's scaling up each force level. It's 10, then 15, then 20, it eventually gets to 50, and now it lasts forever up to force level 99, and you're going to have that chance forever, and then we start another scaling chance up to 99 at 20, and the final numbers are that at force level 20, you're going to have 2 additional 50% chances, and every single force level, you're getting 5% more chance for another enemy. It's a lot to look at, but the result's really simple. Every pod in the game starts with 2 additional units. Normal pods have 5% chance per force level to spawn an additional dude that maxes out at 2 additional dudes across 2 50% chances. Coming over to the tweaks file, we're coming right back to my dynamic aliens by force level settings. I have a single thing here that's not really important, but it is a tweak I've made. I have duplicate unit favor factor 0.8. That means that every time a unit spawns, that pod is going to be 20% less likely to spawn another copy of that unit, just to fan them out a little bit more and avoid having too many units that are just like a pile of vipers. I don't recall who said it in a Steam discussion page, but I saw somebody talking about a bug where you would get -- as your wound time, and then it would seem to resolve pretty much instantly. This is apparently because, if you look at the percentages for wounds, it goes from 10 to 11, so 10.01 to 10.99 are simply unaccounted for. These numbers are all taken from harsher reliable wounds, and coming down to the wound severities, I've taken whatever their table was previously and just added a 0.01 to all of their minimum health percents to fix that bug. Emulator Overhaul is the first of many mods affecting the balance of pioneers, which I found to be oppressively powerful in my campaign. I found that they were virtually unkillable, very, very reliable sources of damage, and the one that I found most offensive that this is changing is I found them to be the de facto best ambush in my team. Their incinerators, or immolators rather, had such long range that I would very regularly set up an ambush for something else and then sigh and use the pioneer because it was just fantastic. So I reduced their range down from, this one is only 8, but all the other ones were 12, and I reduced it to 7 across the board. You can see this is the rest of the immolators receiving the same sort of change. And here I've added the Fire Spark Flamethrower and its Overwatch, the Chem Thrower attacks, which fixes a bug with the Pioneers, where previously a lot of their attacks were not applying the Chem Thrower debuffs if you selected those perks. On the subject of Pioneers, to fix their nigh invulnerability, I've installed Shield Rework. That does most of the work itself, but I've made some tweaks to make it play a little bit nicer with Pioneers. First, Laser Sparks don't have base defense, so I've set this to 0, and I've turned off the inherent low cover a Pioneer would get from having a shield in this rework. The reason is that if a Pioneer has even 1 point of base defense, it is a less appealing target than other Sparks, and its job is to tank. In the code is referred to as Spark Tank. Anything that gives it any amount of positive defense is actually a crippling nerf to its core functionality, so I don't want any of that. In fact, the most intense buff I could possibly give to the Sparks, or to Pioneers rather, is to change that number to -1. Because now they're always getting targeted over the other Sparks, and that would be just great. That's their job. I want them getting targeted, but we're not going to be doing that. But in Shield Rework, it also changed the shields to only scale up defensively and give no additional damage at higher ranks. I have turned back on damage scaling because, especially with the Immolator nerfed, the shield is the bread and butter weapon of the Pioneer. Having it not scale up in damage really doesn't do that class any favors and might be too severe of a nerf. However, compared to the base game, its damage is still nerfed. Previously, it had a +1 chance instead of spread, so now the minimum damage at every level has gone down by 1. Another super minor tweak, I just have cross-class abilities off in the Mitsurugi perk pack. Another minor tweak for multiple sit reps, which is a mod that guarantees you get 3 sit reps. You can customize its chances and numbers. I've set it to 75% chance for 3, so it's not just always the same number. That would feel very gamey. And the reason I have this installed is with the Biodivision and Frost Legion and the Hive, and 400 other mods, you don't really see all the sit reps as much as you should, especially the theme-related ones like Biomod sit reps and then Hive sit reps. They fight for attention, you don't get to see them all, I'd rather see them. So that's all this is. Another very minor tweak is Peak from Concealment's a great mod for making stealth feel more sensible, but it does make you more powerful. It includes an inherent buff to the detection ranges of all enemy units, and I've just buffed that from 1 to 2 to help combat that leniency it gives you just a little bit. There's a mod called Remove Unique Restrictions that I previously ran, but it lets you run multiple vest and ammo types. So instead of having an INI edit to remove those changes, I'll just have an INI edit to add the other changes for making grenades and medkits stackable items. Variable Force Increase is a mod that can be configured to do basically whatever you want in terms of changing the force level. I have it customized to make force levels go, on average, 12 hours slower per force level, but they can randomly go up to 24 hours faster or slower than that average number. Sorry, 48 hours faster or slower than that random number. For the weapon and item overhaul, I've removed the tech requirement for alien alloy integration of resistance communications. The reason I've done that is that unlike the other bridging techs where you feel like you're reverse engineering alien equipment, for alien alloy integration, you have to wait until the first hero mission and then research radio tech that has very little to do with aliens, and then you can do the bridging tech, and it just feels out of place. I understand this is a buff to XCOM, I just don't really mind that it is, that's fine for me. The main thing is it just felt very weird in my campaign to stop and, like, I don't know, autopsy somebody, I guess, when I knew that this is what I wanted, but I was just waiting for the terror mission, and then I had to get this before the thing I wanted, even though they're fundamentally unrelated. It's not bad from a balance perspective. This is probably a good thing from a balance perspective, but it feels too weird for me. I don't like the way that that feels. So I've changed that. Yellow Alert Light's a great mod that fixes one of my main complaints, really my only complaint with Yellow Alert, which is the insane difficulty variance of something like a psionic unit walking in from Fog of War and casting Mind Control, and the only guy who can see him. And there's no counterplay to that. There's nothing that you can interact with that in any way. And whether you're able to handle it and the rest of the game is too easy, or you're not able to handle it and you're just having deaths and mission failures that are out of your hands, either way it shouldn't be happening. Yellow Alert Light changes that so that they only perform defensive actions like buffing and overwatching, and I've turned off, or turned back rather, some of its other changes. I've left down throttling all but increased the unit count to 10 because 6 units is oftentimes not even a full pod with my mod setup, so if you're fighting 2 or more pods, down throttling will kick in. And I've also lowered the down throttle range from 25 to 20 just to make it a bit more likely that if you are pulling Fog of War while down throttling is active, you do end up getting punished for it. Lastly, we have Proficiency Class Pack. I've made some changes to the perk decks for every class. I've tried to cut them down to 4 to 5 perks per class, so it feels a little bit more consistent, and I removed all the blanks. I just like the feel of having lots of perks to pick from on everyone, and not like reliability, but some degree of predictability with what you're going to see. Nothing will ever be guaranteed, but the odds of seeing any individual perk are much higher like this than it previously was. Coming over to the promotion UI, you can see all the mods that actually got removed down here. And you can also see that I've ended up giving the Marine a new perk because one of their trees only had blanks and 3 skills, which without the blanks would guarantee a skill, so I've given them combat conditioning in place of one of those blanks. I've also made some changes to the Combat Engineer plugin. In the base game, or in the base mod rather, they have 1 mobility at Squatty that goes all the way up to 4 additional mobility at Colonel. That's a little bit too much for me for being inherent to a class. I've cut that down to 2 and then front-loaded all of it. Even though that is a buff to them at Squatty, and it is my opinion that they are the strongest class in the game at Squatty without that buff, I like that they have mobility to counteract their inherent need for it to line up flamethrowers and rockets. I just don't think they should have as much as they do, and I prefer that they don't gain any mobility while leveling. It's just a thing they gain when they become a combat engineer, and then it never changes from whatever the starting number is. There's one more thing in tweaks, which is a comparatively small rework of the Sapper class. Skirmisher and Return Fire are, in my opinion, dead perks. I would never pick them. Like, literally never. So rather than having those in the main tree, I have cut those in place of giving them Flush 'em Out and Volatile Mix. Flush 'em Out's a perk card. I've actually taken their previous perk card for smoke grenades and moved that into their main tree to replace one of these, and I've replaced the other with Volatile Mix. But those perks don't go where these perks sit in the tree, so I've had to rearrange the tree a little bit to make that work. I don't recall what the original tree looked like, but I will show you a Sapper in the main game in a little bit when I talk about Skirmishers. Because to talk about Skirmisher rework, we're really going to need to go into the main game and look at a Skirmisher tree. Reason being, I'm sure there are people in the world who can look at this and see the tree. They can be like, oh yeah, I see what all of these numbers say, I can understand what the tree looks like. I can't do that. I feel like the vast majority of people can't do that, so let's just go into the game and look at the reworked trees for both Sappers and Skirmishers. Coming over to the Proficiency Sapper tree, if you haven't seen this in a while, this might just look right to you. To be honest, I'm not even entirely sure what it is that I've changed. I know what abilities are new, but I can't tell you for sure where the original abilities were. Smokescreen was originally a perk card, it wasn't here. And the abilities I removed also weren't here. Same thing with Volatile Mix. Volatile Mix wasn't even available to the class, it was removed with PCP. And a big part of why I wanted to add it back is that the artillery sparks from laser sparks do get Volatile Mix. And I end up finding that without Volatile Mix, I really feel like my Sappers aren't quite as good as they should be. I think Volatile Mix is really helpful for distinguishing them from combat engineers, keeping them on pace for artillery, and just making sure that they're more than just cover destruction for other characters. And something you'll notice when you look at the way that I've rearranged the tree is I've tried very hard to make it more consistent in its lines. I have a much more dedicated Fusilier tree where it's very clear this is the tree about using guns. This line obviously has grenades involved because there's an entire column of grenades, one's gotta go here. But now support grenades are much more their own thing, offensive grenades are very clearly their own thing, and no longer the Fusilier perks sort of scattered throughout the tree, now they're all in one little gun line. That's something I really like a lot, is having very clearly defined trees in terms of what kind of perks they are, and we're going to see that a lot going into our next tree, or I suppose I should say our next mod, as we come over to the Skirmisher rework. The first thing I want to draw attention to is that I've increased their aim from 80 to 85 at Colonel, and the way I've done this is entirely front-loaded at Squatty. They receive 5 additional aim. Baseline, across their entire career, they would gain 15 aim like a Marine and most offensive classes, as opposed to 25 aim like a Marksman or a Reaper. I've given them a middle ground between those two numbers at 20, with all of that front-loaded, much like most of a Sniper and Reaper's aim is front-loaded. And I guess to explain why I've increased our aim, I need to talk about what it is about proficiency skirmishers that I felt needed to be improved. Now, with all of my changes, inherently the fact that I've changed something means there is something I thought could be improved, or something that I didn't like if you want to be negative. And I'm worried that this might come across as being negative, since I am explaining why I've changed proficiency skirmishers explicitly. So I want to be very clear now, proficiency skirmishers are fantastic. They're the only version of skirmisher I've played that I actually feel like they have a clear identity and a designed and well thought out play pattern. I really, really like the heat mechanic, and I actually think they're an alright to good class even. I have three main problems with them. One of them is very, very trifling and unfair though. One of my problems with them is that despite being designed around not moving very much because they want to be firing their gun or meleeing, and grappling to high ground which has low cover, they don't have low profile, which makes it very hard to get them in good positions to do the thing they want to do. Obviously, you can see I fixed that. My other two issues are much more severe though. The first is that at late game, the proficiency kernels don't have those crazy abilities like Face Off, Banish, Annihilation from Reapers, the entire last 2 lines of Templar, Throw a Dart. They're just not as strong as the other faction heroes are, and while they're a good class by the merits of like a normal soldier where you promoted them and picked their class, compared to the faction heroes they fall short. Which would be acceptable if they were much stronger in the early game, but they're actually the weakest class in the early game, not the weakest faction hero. I think at Squatty and Corporal, proficiency skirmishers are the weakest class in the game. And that's the main reason that I ended up making this rework. And it's the main reason they've gotten this 5 aim bonus at Squatty. And the main contributing factor to them feeling so weak is that realistically, they basically just get grapple. I know there's a lot of things highlighted in blue here at Squatty, but it's kind of just grapple until Sergeant. Let me explain why. The heat sink mechanic is awesome. Shoot your gun at build heat, more heat is more crit chance and more damage on your ripjack. Really cool mechanic. The longer you're fighting, the more heat you have. Now that part's a little bit sketchy in the early game, because if you're fighting for a long time in the early game, things are probably going horrifically wrong. But that's not the reason it's not working well early. You've also got Marauder, shoot your gun twice, and you've got your ripjack strike to run in and melee a dude. And that all sounds great. You also start with a grapple, and at Sergeant you'll get free grapple abilities just like a Captain, but we're not there yet, so it's really just the grapple for now. The issue, however, is that with Marauder, with your base squatty aim of like 68, I think, in the base game, and your Bullpup, which has negative range penalties at far ranges, you're probably not able to shoot twice. And with your Ripjack that leaves you stranded wherever you ran to, it doesn't even have a 100% chance to hit until Sergeant. So you're building up heat for a better Ripjack that isn't reliable or safe to use, and Marauder lets you take a second shot, but usually both of them suck because you have bad starting aim, you don't have scopes yet, you don't have aim PCS yet, so you got a grapple hook, and that's it. And it really all just comes down to not having enough accuracy. The Ripjack isn't safe enough to use because you're going to be left in the open, you don't even know if you're going to kill the guy you're targeting. Marauder gives you 2 shots, but usually you want to move and shoot anyway because you're not very accurate unless you're right next to the guy in the early game. Both halves of the heatsink gameplay loop, the shooting your gun to build heat and the using the Ripjack, aren't individually good things to be doing in most situations, so you end up not really having anything but the grappling hook. That additional 5 aim gets this Ripjack to 98% chance to hit at Squatty, 100 at Corporal, and it gets these Marauder shots that can feel pretty bad to be substantially better. So that's a really, really big change. 5 aim is just a lot to give the class generally, but especially here, the impact of this 5 aim is pretty tremendous. Another thing that I think didn't help the class is that their Corporal perks, in my opinion, did nothing for the class. When I was trying to give Skirmishers their best shot in my campaign, I skipped Corporal. I didn't buy anything, and I saved it to spend at Sergeant and Lieutenant on what I perceived to be as better perks. And there were some better perks later in the tree, like Explosive Action, that completely changed the way the character played and vastly improved how effective they were. So I've removed a good chunk of perks in this tree. Unlike the Sapper tree, this doesn't look like the original Skirmisher, like at all. This looks very different. In fact, I've renamed the trees: Tactician from the base game, Striker from Proficiency, and then the new tree, Guerrilla from Main. All three trees are, to a degree, action economy trees, centered around movement and just taking more actions. Because to me, the identity of this new heatsink Skirmisher goes beyond just shooting to build heat and then meleeing. You are super greedy. You don't want to move. If your cover gets destroyed, you want someone else to throw a smoke on you or a spark to run in front of you. You're busy building heat. If you need a flank shot on somebody, you're not going to throw the grenade yourself with total combat. You're going to ask somebody else to throw the grenade for you with combat presence. In my opinion, the heatsink playstyle really led to this almost damage carry playstyle from MOBAs, where the rest of the team was trying very hard to enable the Skirmisher to do their job, and I really like that self-centered style of gameplay that it caused. None of the previous iterations of Skirmisher, not in the base game or in Proficiency, really had any serious focus on either explosives or guns. They both featured to some small degree, but they were never core ideas. And I've removed all of the perks that were not action economy perks relating to explosives and guns outright. Striker is the clear melee tree. It's going to be pretty obviously correct in terms of its identity. Tactician is the tree involving all the various utility abilities, namely the grappling abilities and the action economy abilities. Guerrilla tends to be more about movement abilities and gun-related abilities. And I'll go through starting with Striker, and then once I've gone through all of them, I'll try to explain what the mindset was behind each various round. And before I even get into Striker, looking at combat conditioning, I should say this. Most classes have a lot of perks that are more niche, less obviously good, and you can look through it and be like, these are the perks I want pretty aggressively. You can be like, what I want, trash, 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 I'm taking this one, trash, good, good, trash, great, okay. And you immediately have an idea of what your route through the tree is. It's not any sort of bad thing, it's just the way it works. There tends to be clearly good abilities, clearly weaker abilities, and more niche abilities. And depending on what you want out of your character, you can just immediately tell the path you'll take. And I can do that. I can go through here and find a path through the tree that I think is the best one. However, there really aren't many weak perks in the tree. There is, like, combat conditioning is, I think, kind of the full extent of the stuff that I would call filler in this tree. You could probably buy every single perk in this tree and not regret it. You just shouldn't do that. There's better places to spend your AP than all in one soldier. Well, I guess you would regret buying Retribution and Close Combat Specialist when you clicked on this and saw that they didn't stack. But except for that. Going through the trees for real now, starting with Striker, because you're building towards melee, that's the end goal of all this heat generation. We have combat conditioning for more mobility and more aim to reposition around the map more, and to have a better chance of hitting those enemies that have inherent defense. Or, and this is actually an important part of why I put this in the tree, if you're playing with point-based not created equal, your average aim at this rank, I believe, is 101. Which means a below average Skirmisher wouldn't have a guaranteed hit on their Ripjack, and you could take this to guarantee it. It can also make you more accurate against late game enemies that have more defenses, or things like a low profile Chosen. Then we have Hit and Run. This was previously the capstone ability, and I just don't feel like it should be. This is fundamentally a melee class. It's built around enabling the Ripjack. Templars start with 100% on Rend. Assaults get 100% on Rend on Corporal, and then at Sergeant, they're going to pick up their ability, Breakthrough, that lets them move afterwards. Templars had it at Squatty as Momentum. You didn't get Hit and Run until the very end of the tree as a Colonel, and that made it really hard to aggressively use Ripjack until the end of the game, really. So I feel like this needs to be an early thing. It's a core part of the class. It's really important. Next, we have Untouchable, standard defensive ability. Then we have Retribution, aka Blade Storm, but with Ripjacks. Next up, we have Rip and Tear in the Heat column. Makes your Ripjack better. I'm not going to cover what the perks do too much beyond hovering them and letting you see if you want to pause it, unless I've added them to the tree. And lastly, we have Ruthless, which I think deserves to be a capstone 100%, because unlike most classes where it's +1 damage, and that's most of it because the crit chance is sort of unreliable, with a Skirmisher at full heat, I want to say it's 97.5% chance to crit because of Ruthless. This gives you nearly guaranteed crits on a Skirmisher. It's not random throughput that you can't predict. It is the reason your crits are predictable, and it's really valuable. It deserves its capstone status. Next, since most of these abilities were originally Skirmisher abilities, I'm going to go through the Tactician tree. I've moved Explosive Action up to Corporal. Action Economy is the name of the game. And Explosive Action, it's not Overdrive, but it's trying real hard to be Overdrive for Skirmishers. It does a lot of work, and having access to abilities like this early let you fix that problem where you need to move to shoot, and you've only got 2 actions, so Marauder's not doing anything. Next, we have Reinforced Cabling, which makes all the grapple hooks use different cooldowns instead of having one shared cooldown. Manual Overdrive is an ability that was removed, and I'm worried it might have been removed because it's really strong with a bunch of cooldown abilities, and I've only added more of them. I suspect this might be incredibly overpowered. If it is, I'll have to change it later. But Manual Override is something I never saw people talk about, so I'm hoping it's just really cool and not too broken. But as we go through all the cooldown abilities, you might see why it could get out of hand. Then we have Combat Presence. I said earlier I view this as a really greedy, self-centered class, but it's always had Combat Presence. The ability came with Skirmishers and War of the Chosen, and it's the right sort of team utility, right? The do-it-yourself sort of team utility. In the Heat column, we have Thermal Regulators just for keeping the heat longer. And then I've given them back Whiplash as a core ability as opposed to a perk deck ability, and I run the Whiplash Overhaul mod by, I believe, Matsuri, and that makes this a cooldown-based ability, thus inherits synergy with Manual Overdrive, and it fits nicely into the Reinforced Cabling Grappling sort of tree. Then coming down to Gorilla, this is again our movement and gun sort of tree. We have Sprint. Sprint, in an ideal circumstance, is just the objectively better explosive action, but it's also much less flexible. Next, we have Phase from Reapers, and it's not the only perk we're taking from Reapers that does a lot of work here. I really disliked having lightning reflexes on my Skirmisher because I thought of them as greedy carries that didn't help the team. Phase gives them Shadow Step instead, letting them get all the benefits of lightning reflexes without helping anyone else. It also helps them with their need for team support, and it helps them give you a reason to be supported by the team. Now that you get repositioned and you can take a partial move after shooting somebody, suddenly your teammates blowing up cover for you to give you the flank shot is even more strongly incentivized because you get to move as a free action afterwards. Low Profile was never going to neatly fit in with any tree, but it is somewhat a defensive movement ability insofar as it allows you new locations to move to and makes you need to move less, or it gives you new avenues to move through. Previously, Skirmishers were sort of inherently dangerous because they so often put themselves in low cover, and this changes that. You're no longer constantly sprinting into low cover with your whole team, otherwise it would just be low cover on the Skirmisher only and he gets focus fired down. Competing with Bladestorm, we have Close Combat Specialist. I love this perk. I kind of wanted to remove it because it's mutually exclusive with Retribution and doing a very similar thing. But it's actually like the perfect sort of gun perk for a Skirmisher to have, because it's shooting your gun and building heat without spending any actions. It's all action economy heat generation. It's team utility in a way that's entirely self-centered. It's absolutely perfect thematically for a Skirmisher. For the heat tree, we have Fire and Fury, and I've changed this perk in the configs. It used to be every 3 levels of heat. The reason I've lowered it to 2 is not because I think it needed the buff. I have no idea if it did or didn't. It's so that you always have the decision to make where if you shoot your gun, you gain 1 mobility and it can let you move 1 tile further. I really like that. If it's at 3, then it only gives you the decision 2/3 of the time, and I don't like that. And lastly, for a capstone ability for gun economy, we have the Reaper's Death from Above, where once per turn, killing someone from above refunds an action. And you can see some insane possibilities for action economy coming out of this class, in terms of taking a flank shot with reposition, moving towards a building, grappling up to it, pulling someone to you, using explosive action, getting a kill with Death from Above, ripjacking to somebody else, moving away with Untouchable and Hit and Run into high cover somewhere else, which is really low cover, but you're a Skirmisher, so you don't care. The end game, where you have all of these perks working in conjunction and you bought more of them. This character is the most hyper-mobile, ridiculous thing in the game, and I'm hoping that they'll be rivaling, maybe even surpassing, I wouldn't mind, Reapers and Templars when you get there. If they're a little bit more powerful, I'm actually completely fine with that. It's only if they're glaringly overpowered do I feel like I've messed up, but having one campaign where Skirmishers were the just dominant, most powerful class, it'd be about time, right? I wouldn't be too mad about it. But the way I'm trying to get the Skirmisher to live up to the Reaper and Templar is that rather than having these big single abilities that are just incredibly strong, it's just incrementally, every level, getting another perk that does something really powerful. No matter what perk you go to, you're getting something that meaningfully pushes the Skirmisher to be more mobile and more threatening. And it just never stops. No matter how much AP you put into them, they keep scaling up towards that goal. And I do strongly believe that this version of Skirmishers is going to be strong, like very strong. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. I'm just worried that it might be too strong, which is a good fear to have, and once it turns out to clearly be too strong, I will find a way to tone them down. Anyways, I think that's about it for me. I think that's most of the mods covered. Again, quick reminders. I don't know them off the top of my head. There'll be credits that roll into this. Standing on the shoulders of giants here. Couldn't have done it without the people who came before me. I barely consider myself a modder. I'm just editing I&Is over here, which leads to a reminder. First mods I've made, probably gonna have something wrong with them that I didn't foresee or even know about, for which I'm sorry. What can you do? Anyways, I've been rather incoherent. Hopefully you'll enjoy playing with these mods, or at least enjoyed hearing about them and I didn't just waste your time. See you in the next one.